My coffee went cold while I listened to my 7-year-old son ask his mother if we were getting divorced. My name is Michael. I'm 39. I manage construction projects in Boise, mostly commercial builds, warehouses, the occasional office complex. I've been married to Rachel for 11 years. We have a son, Eli, 7 years old. And that morning he sat at the table in his dinosaur pajamas, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate, looking not at me and not at his mother, but at some invisible point between us. The place kids seem to find when adults stop saying the truth out loud. Mom, are you and Dad getting divorced? Rachel dropped her spoon. Didn't shatter anything, just dropped it, and the sound was somehow too loud for our small kitchen. I remember watching her hand instead of her face, the way her fingers froze over the table for a second, like she'd forgotten what they were for. Why would you think that, buddy? She asked, and her voice was even. Too even. I heard you on the phone. At night. You said, I can't do this anymore. Eli said it plainly, the way 7-year-olds state facts from a school textbook, not yet understanding the weight some adult sentences carry. I didn't know what call he meant. And that, the not knowing, was the first crack that morning, though I didn't understand yet that I was looking at a crack and not a coincidence. What follows is a story I never told anyone except one person. 2 years before that day, I would have sworn my family was the most ordinary, boringly in the best sense family on our street. We married at 28, both of us. Bought the house on Harrison Street when Eli was 3. Rachel worked as an event coordinator at a downtown hotel, weddings, corporate galas, conferences. I built warehouses and strip malls and took pride in delivering projects without a single missed deadline. We were normal. We were, I thought, solid. That morning I smiled at my son and told him nobody was getting divorced, that Mom was probably talking about someone else at work. Eli nodded and went back to his eggs, and the question seemed to dissolve into the morning light. But I noticed Rachel leave the kitchen a few seconds earlier than usual, noticed her run the bathroom faucet harder than necessary just to wash her hands. Something in me shifted. I couldn't name it yet, but I felt it right away. I got through breakfast, dropped Eli at school, and the whole drive to the job site on Fir Tree Road I drove on autopilot. One phrase looping in my head. I can't do this anymore. Who had she said that to? And why hadn't I heard the call? I decided not to ask. At the time it felt reasonable. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I was sure the answer would be simple, boring, work-related. Rachel was running a 300-guest wedding that weekend, and the strain in her voice was easy enough to explain as stress. I'm good at finding explanations. For 11 years that had seemed like a virtue. It turned out to be something else entirely. A way of not looking where looking scared me. That evening, after Eli was asleep, Rachel sat on the couch with her phone face down. I remember it because she'd never done that before. I asked if everything was okay. Just tired, she said, and smiled the smile I'd known for 11 years. One that had half a shade less light in it than usual. I believed her, or pretended to, because it was easier for both of us that way. That night, I lay awake longer than I told myself I would, listening to her breathe beside me. Steady, too steady for someone who, it seemed to me, wasn't sleeping either. The following weeks passed with a deceptive smoothness. I worked 10, 12-hour days, chasing concrete deliveries and permits, and came home each evening to the smell of dinner and a son who told me about dinosaurs with the particular conviction 7-year-olds reserve for things they believe completely. Rachel was deep into that 300-guest wedding. The bride kept changing her mind 3 times a week, and my wife started coming home later than usual, explaining it as meetings with florists and caterers. I didn't count her hours. Counting a spouse's hours felt like something a trusting husband didn't do. But there were details, not evidence, just details that seemed small at the time and looked different now. She started stepping out of rooms when her phone rang, not dramatically, just weaving it naturally into routine. I'll go close the window, let me check on Eli. Once I noticed a new perfume on her scarf, not the one she'd worn for years, something warmer, with notes of sandalwood. I asked about it in passing, and she said it was a gift from a coworker, just a sample. I didn't ask why she was sampling that sample every day for 2 weeks. Something inside me had already tightened, though I couldn't put it into words yet. I didn't ask, not because I didn't want to know, but because I was afraid of the answer, an answer I'd then have to do something about. Silence was easier. Silence let me keep being a man whose life was fine. Eli grew strangely quiet those evenings. Not fussy, just quiet. the way kids absorb tension that adults around them try to hide. He asked me once why mom seemed sad on the inside, even when she smiles. Kids notice what adults work hard to hide from each other because they haven't yet learned the habit of not seeing the obvious. Rachel started bringing her phone into the shower with her, set it on the shelf by the sink, screen down. She used to leave it on the nightstand without a thought. I want to pause here for a second, because if you've ever noticed a detail in someone that didn't fit the picture but told yourself it meant nothing, you know exactly what that feels like. Looking and not seeing, because seeing costs too much. One evening near the end of the month, she came home from a catering meeting with her hair mussed and a flush that didn't match the cool October air. I said she looked nice. She laughed a beat too fast and said she'd run from the car because it had started raining. It hadn't rained that evening. I noticed and said nothing. My brother Dave, who I talked to every couple of weeks, asked casually if things were good at home, and I said, "Everything's great," so quickly it surprised even me. Dave didn't push. Maybe someone should have pushed then, but no one did, and I kept living in the comfortable version of reality I'd built for myself. Looking back now, that was a moment I should have asked the question I kept avoiding. At the time I called it tact. I'd call it something else now. By November, the small things had stopped being small. They'd started forming a pattern I stubbornly refused to see whole. Rachel began staying at events past midnight more often, even though the 300-guest wedding had come and gone successfully by her account. She talked about new clients, a pharmaceutical conference, a local businessman's anniversary party, but the details in her stories had grown vague, as if she were describing work she'd glimpsed rather than done. One evening, Eli drew a family picture at school, 3 stick figures holding hands, and when I hung it on the fridge, Rachel walked past without stopping to look, the way she used to. I noticed it out of the corner of my eye and said nothing. Every time a specific detail was about to snap into a full picture, I found a way to break it back into harmless pieces. One evening in particular stuck with me. We were eating dinner, the 3 of us, when Rachel's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and something flickered across her face, barely visible, like a ripple from a stone dropped far away. She stood, said, "Work," and stepped onto the porch, though she'd always taken work calls at the table before, never seeing a reason to hide the conversation. Through the half-open window, I caught the tone, not the words, quiet, almost pleading, nothing like how she talked to caterers. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever sat at the same table with someone and already knew, not in your head, but somewhere deeper, that something was wrong and kept cutting your chicken like nothing was happening, you understand what I felt that evening. She came back 7 minutes later. I remember the time because I checked my watch for some reason and said the client was anxious about the menu. I nodded. I always nodded. That same week, my coworker Jen mentioned, in passing, that she'd seen Rachel at a coffee shop on Main Street on a Thursday afternoon, the same time Rachel had told me she'd be meeting florists across town. Jen said it with no agenda at all, just small city small talk. I smiled and said she probably had a gap between meetings. She hadn't been alone at that table. Jen mentioned a man, some business partner, I guess. I didn't ask further. Some part of me already didn't want to know the name. She told me much later what was happening on her side of things that day. That Thursday in the coffee shop, by her account, she'd been sitting across from Daniel, the co-planner on that pharmaceutical event, telling herself this was the last time, that after this she'd stop answering his messages. She felt lighter around him than she did at home, where, she said, she'd stopped feeling like a person and started feeling like a function, a wife, a mother, an organizer of other people's celebrations who'd never had one of her own. She told herself she'd just have coffee and leave. That's what she told me. I knew none of it at the time. Eli started asking strange questions in those weeks. Is mom tired of us? Do you and mom still love each other? Questions a 7-year-old doesn't invent on his own, but absorbs from the atmosphere of a house, the way a sponge absorbs water without understanding what it's absorbing. The red flag I called just work stress at the time was, in fact, the first clear signal that my wife was living some part of her life separately from me. I didn't want to see it, because seeing it would have meant acting, and acting would have meant risking everything I called my family. By late November, I'd started behaving differently myself, without quite noticing. I started coming home later, finding reasons to linger at the site longer than the job required. Not because I didn't want to be home, but because home held a tension I couldn't name, and I preferred avoiding it to untangling it. In early December, I found a receipt. It fell out of the pocket of her coat as I was taking it to the dry cleaners. A printed hotel bill from a place half an hour outside the city, dated a Tuesday afternoon when Rachel had told me she was meeting a decor vendor. A room for two. Paid on a card I didn't recognize. Not our joint one, something separate. I stood holding that piece of paper longer than it took to read it. I didn't tell her. Instead, I started collecting, quietly, methodically, the same way I'd compile data for a site report. Dates, times, discrepancies. I checked her work calendar, which she'd given me access to years ago in case anything ever needed coordinating. 3 meetings in the past month didn't match what she'd told me out loud. I found a message thread, not all of it, just a fragment she'd forgotten to delete from a cloud backup on our shared laptop. The name, Daniel, showed up there more often than a business partner's name should. What surprised me was that I didn't feel rage in that moment. I felt something colder, more methodical, as if some part of me had been preparing for this for a long time and was now simply filing the confirmations into place. My brother Dave, once I finally told him part of what was happening, suggested I talk to her directly instead of gathering evidence in secret. I said I needed to know everything before I said a word. Looking back, I think collecting proof was my way of controlling a situation I actually had no control over at all, a way to delay the moment I'd have to admit my family wasn't what I believed it to be. A false lead appeared in mid-December. Rachel suddenly grew warmer toward me, started planning date nights, talked about a family trip to her parents in Spokane for Christmas. Part of me, the part that had trusted her for 11 years, wanted to believe it had all been a misunderstanding, that the receipt had some innocent explanation, that Daniel was just a coworker's name. I nearly let myself believe it. But 2 days before Christmas, I saw her sit in the car in the driveway longer than usual before coming inside, just sitting there, staring ahead, as if steeling herself. When she came in, her eyes were red, and when I asked if she was okay, she answered too fast and too certain. She told me later what was going through her head in those minutes in the car. She'd been sitting there because Daniel had told her that day he couldn't share her anymore, that he needed all of her or none of it. She felt the ground shift under her, not because she feared losing him, but because for the first time she saw clearly what her life had become. 2 parallel worlds, neither of which felt like a real home anymore. She sat in the car rehearsing how she'd walk in with an ordinary face. I didn't know then that she was rehearsing exactly that. On Christmas Eve, once Eli was asleep, I laid everything I'd gathered out on the kitchen table, the receipt, the message printouts, the list of mismatched dates. Not to show her in that moment, but so I could finally stop doubting myself. I needed to see it all at once, to stop hunting for excuses. I put the papers back in the folder and lay down beside my sleeping, or pretending to sleep, wife, and for the second time that month didn't close my eyes until morning. The exposure didn't happen the way I'd planned. It happened by accident, and, strangely, our son was the one responsible. On the 2nd of January, a Saturday morning, Eli grabbed my phone to play a game while I made breakfast and accidentally opened a browser tab I'd forgotten to close the night before, the PDF I'd printed of Rachel's messages with Daniel, part of my own private file. He didn't understand what he was reading, but he asked out loud, at the table, in front of his mother, "Dad, who's Daniel, the guy who tells Mom he misses her?" The room seemed to stop breathing for a few seconds. Rachel went pale. Something in me simultaneously collapsed and, at the same time, became absolutely, icily clear. It wasn't relief. It was more like the exhale after holding your breath too long. Knowing what comes next will hurt more, not less. "Eli, go to your room for a minute, okay?" I said, and my voice came out calmer than I felt. He left, not understanding what he'd just done, and that, I think, was the one mercy of that morning, that he never learned what door he'd just opened. I didn't make a scene at the table. I got up quietly, and later, once I was sure he was playing calmly with his blocks, I went and sat on the edge of my son's bed for maybe 20 minutes, saying nothing, listening to him mutter something to his dinosaurs. When I came out of his room, my face had already changed, closed in a way it hadn't been before. Rachel was waiting in the kitchen. She didn't try to defend herself, didn't try to get ahead of me with explanations. She just sat at the table and cried quietly. Not sobbing, not dramatic, just tears that seemed to fall on their own while she searched for words and couldn't find them. "Tell me everything," I said. Not shouted, just said it. Even because by then shouting felt too late. Rage hadn't come, something heavier had. She lifted her head, and what she said next I remember almost word for word. She finally spoke. This is what she told me. "It started at the conference in September," she said. "I'd been feeling invisible for months. Not in a bad way. You hadn't done anything wrong. We'd just both gotten so used to the routine that I stopped feeling like a person and started feeling like a schedule. Daniel noticed me, really noticed, asked how I was doing, and listened to the answer. The first time it was just dinner after an event, and I told myself it meant nothing, that I just needed someone to see me. Then it became late-night messages, then that hotel in November, and every time I told myself it was the last time. I was afraid that if I stopped, I'd go back to being invisible. Afraid that if you found out, everything would fall apart. And even more afraid that if you didn't, I'd just keep living split in two. I couldn't look at Eli's drawing on the fridge for weeks, 3 little figures holding hands, because I felt like I was destroying exactly that. I tried to stop in December. I couldn't. And then Eli said his name out loud this morning. And honestly, part of me felt relief that I didn't have to carry it alone anymore. I listened without answering. Something shifted in my chest. Not rage, but something older and quieter, closer to a pain I'd known about for a long time and was only now calling by its name. I understood something then that I didn't want to understand. I hadn't been building a marriage the last few years. I'd been maintaining its appearance and telling myself that was the same thing. I didn't shout. I didn't break anything. I got up, took my keys, and said I needed to walk. She didn't try to stop me. Dave, who I called from the car, showed up 20 minutes later and just sat with me by the Boise River, saying nothing until I was ready to talk myself. The weeks that followed felt like slowly taking apart a house that had seemed solid but had been built over a crack no one wanted to notice. Daniel, it turned out, through mutual acquaintances in the events industry, was married himself, and his wife found out about the affair almost the same time we did, through her own accidental discovery. Their marriage collapsed within a month, and in professional circles around town people started keeping their distance from him. Colleagues who'd once recommended him to clients quietly stopped. He lost not just his family, but a chunk of a reputation he'd spent years building. Rachel lost the thing she'd guarded most, without realizing it, the image of herself as someone who would never do this. She lost Eli's trust, even if he didn't understand the whole picture. He started asking why Dad slept in the guest room now, and there was a new carefulness in his questions that hadn't been there before. She lost the version of the marriage where she could be both a mother and a woman who was truly seen, because it turned out you couldn't have that by breaking the house her own son lived in. We didn't divorce right away. I didn't want decisions made in a state where the pain speaks louder than judgment. We lived apart under the same roof for 2 months, her in the guest room, me in what used to be our bedroom. And during that time I saw a therapist once a week, not to save the marriage, but to understand who I wanted to be on the other side of it. I realized something in those months I'd never put into words before. The conflict avoidance I'd taken pride in for 11 years, calling it patience, was actually a form of fear. Fear of hearing an answer I'd then have to do something about. I never asked about the perfume, never asked about the late meetings, never asked about the phone turned face down, not because I trusted her unconditionally, but because I was afraid trust would turn out to be misplaced, and then I'd have to admit my whole life needed re-examining. In late February, Rachel asked to talk. She said she wanted to come back, not to the old marriage, but to a new, honest one, if I was willing to build it. She spoke calmly, no tears this time, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before, not pleading, but an acknowledgement that the decision wasn't only hers to make. I listened to her for a long time. Then I said what I actually felt, that I respected her honesty now, but I couldn't go back to a place where betrayal had once lived inside our walls. I didn't slam the door in that moment. I just closed it quietly as I'd opened it 11 years before. She nodded. She understood. The door was closed, not in anger, but in the clarity I'd finally allowed myself. We finalized the divorce in April. No scenes, an honest split of everything we'd built. We share custody of Eli evenly, and I still try, never to speak badly of his mother in front of him, because he still loves her, and he should. One evening, 6 months after the divorce, as Eli was getting ready for bed in my new apartment, he asked, "Dad, are you happier now?" I thought about it longer than I usually think before answering my son. "I'm more honest, buddy," I said. "And that seems like the first step toward actually being happy." He nodded, like the answer satisfied him completely, and fell asleep within 5 minutes. I sat in his doorway a long while after that, watching the dinosaur blanket rise and fall, thinking about how much truth kids can handle once adults finally stop hiding it from them. The most painful part of this story wasn't the affair itself. It was how many months I knew without letting myself know. The red flags weren't hidden. The perfume I didn't recognize. The phone turned face down. The rain that never fell. They sat right on the surface, and I carefully stepped around each one, because acknowledging them would have meant tearing down the version of myself where I was a husband who had everything under control. There were two real turning points. The first was the hotel receipt falling out of a coat pocket. From that moment, I stopped trusting and started collecting facts, which was itself an admission that trust was already gone. The second was our 7-year-old's offhand question at breakfast. A truth two adults had carefully hidden from each other, and from him came out not through drama, but through a child's innocence. He'd simply read a word on a screen. The lesson I took from this isn't that you should check your partner's phone or suspect every late meeting. It's something else. Avoiding an uncomfortable conversation isn't protecting a relationship. It's slowly dismantling it under the guise of peace. I spent 11 years proud of never making scenes, of trusting unconditionally, when really, I was just afraid of what might surface if I asked the question out loud. As for Rachel, I don't excuse what she did, but I understand where it came from. Loneliness inside a marriage is real, and it doesn't always look like fighting or obvious unhappiness. Sometimes it looks like routine, the kind that lets two people stop truly seeing each other while still living side by side. That's not a justification for her choice. The choice was hers, and the consequences were hers to carry. But it's an explanation worth hearing if you want to understand rather than only judge. Would anything have changed if I'd asked earlier about the perfume, the rain, the phone? Maybe nothing. Or maybe the conversation would have happened 2 months earlier, before the hotel, before the name our son read out loud at breakfast. We'll never know. That might be the most honest conclusion in all of this. Not every door closes in time, and not every question gets asked while asking it still matters. If you've ever noticed a detail that didn't fit the picture and told yourself it meant nothing, you already know half of this story, even before hearing it to the end. I don't hold hatred for Rachel. That would be easier, but it wouldn't be honest. What I hold on to instead is a question that still surfaces some evenings. How many more years might I have lived inside that quiet lie if our son hadn't asked what he asked at breakfast? The betrayal itself wasn't the hardest part. Learning what I was capable of not seeing, that was. And I think that's the most important thing I took from all of it. Silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just pain deferred. If you've got one word for someone who once let you down, or a moment you chose not to notice a warning sign, leave it in the comments. Not for drama, just so you know you're not the only one. Thank you for staying with this one, especially if you've had your own drawing on the fridge you were afraid of losing.